She stood in the middle of that barn with 43 people staring at her like she was something they'd scraped off their boots. And not a single man in the room would take her hand. Not one. Every rejection had come with an excuse. Too poor, too proud, too marked by her father's failures. And when the last man turned his back, something in Elena Cross didn't break. It went absolutely cold. She didn't know that the doors were about to open. She didn't know that the most feared man in the northern wilderness had just walked into her worst night. And she had no idea that by morning, everything was going to change. If this story already has you, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this reaches. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You're going to want to see where Elena ends up. The cold came early that year. It rolled down from the high peaks sometime around the second week of November. A mean, gray cold that had teeth in it. The kind that didn't just bite at your fingers, but settled into your joints and stayed there. By the time the last of the autumn traders had packed up their wagons and headed south toward warmer settlements, Iron Hollow had already pulled itself inward like a fist closing, every family barricading against the coming months with firewood and salted meat and whatever human warmth they could hold on to. It was a hard place, Iron Hollow, 17 years old as a settlement, and it had never quite shaken the feeling of being temporary. The buildings were solid enough, timber-framed, thick-walled, chinked against the wind, but they sat against the mountain backdrop like something the wilderness was tolerating rather than welcoming. The people who lived there knew this. They'd built their lives in the shadow of peaks that didn't care whether they survived or not, and that knowledge had made them practical in ways that sometimes crossed the line into something colder than the weather. The gathering happened every year in the last week of November, before the deep winter locked everything down. Some settlements called it a social, some called it a market fair. In Iron Hollow, nobody bothered dressing it up with a pretty name. It was what it was, a marriage gathering, a practical exchange where families took stock of who was available, who was suitable, and who could benefit whom. Love wasn't exactly off the table, but it sat at the far end of the table, near the door, where nobody paid it much attention. The Callaway barn was the biggest structure in Iron Hollow, and on gathering nights it smelled of pine resin, candle wax, fresh hay, and the particular nervous sweat of people trying to make impressions. Someone had strung lanterns along the ceiling beams. Someone else had pushed the livestock stalls to one side and arranged rough-hewn benches in the open space. A fiddler sat in the corner working through a song that nobody was dancing to yet. Elena Cross arrived 15 minutes late because her horse had thrown a shoe on the frozen road 3 miles out, and she'd walked the rest of the way. She didn't tell anyone this. She came through the side door, snow still caught in the wool of her coat, her boots leaving wet prints on the plank floor, and she kept her chin level and her expression arranged into something she hoped looked like calm dignity rather than exhausted desperation. She was 24 years old. She had dark hair that she'd pinned up with more effort than she'd admit, and eyes the color of river ice, pale gray with hints of something deeper underneath. Her hands, even in her gloves, told a different story than her face. They were the hands of someone who had been working without stopping for a very long time. She found a spot near the wall and stood there, getting her bearings. The barn was full, maybe 60 people, which was most of the settlement's adult population. She recognized almost every face: Mabel Trent with her 3 daughters in their good dresses, the Osborne brothers, all 4 of them, broad-shouldered and sour-mouthed. The Haverford family clustered near the food table, Thomas Grayburn standing by himself near the fiddler, which meant he'd already had something to drink. And there, yes, there it was, the subtle thing she'd been dreading, the slight shift in the room when people noticed her. Not a dramatic reaction, nothing so honest as that, just a fractional turning away, a redirecting of attention, a careful not looking that was worse than being stared at. She knew what they thought of her. She'd known for 3 years, since her father's debts had come due, and his reputation had followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Samuel Cross had been a man who borrowed more faith than he ever repaid. He'd come to Iron Hollow with big ideas and bigger promises, had talked 3 families into backing his timber venture, and when the venture had collapsed under the weight of his own poor planning and worse luck, he hadn't stayed to face the consequences. He'd left in the night, left the debt, left the questions, left Elena to face it all alone. She'd been 21. She'd spent the 3 years since working the small parcel of land he'd left behind, paying back what she could, eating what she grew, and listening to the settlement decide what kind of woman she was based entirely on what kind of man her father had been. It was Margaret Haverford who first acknowledged her. Margaret was 60-something, sharp as a new nail, and had the social authority of someone who'd outlived every rival opinion. She crossed the barn with the deliberate stride of a woman who moved through the world on her own schedule. Elena. She said it the way you'd say the name of a weather condition. Informative, not particularly welcoming. Mrs. Haverford. You're late. Horse through a shoe. Margaret's eyes moved over her with the frank assessment of someone appraising livestock. You walk from the ridge? Most of it. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the older woman's expression. Not admiration, exactly. More like the grudging acknowledgement you'd give a stubborn weed for surviving a hard winter. Well, she said, and then seemed to decide that was sufficient and moved away. The evening started. Elena was not ignorant of how these things worked. You didn't stand by the wall all night looking like you were waiting for something to happen. That was the fastest way to ensure that nothing would. She made herself move, made herself engage in the conversations that presented themselves, made herself smile at the right moments. She was good at this. She'd had to be these past 3 years. Survival in a small community required a particular kind of social management that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with persistence. But the reality of the gathering revealed itself slowly and then all at once. It started with Jacob Mercer. Jacob was 31, a carpenter, decent-looking in an unremarkable way. They'd spoken maybe a dozen times over the years, always pleasantly. She approached him near the food table with what she hoped was an easy, natural smile. Jacob, how's the new workshop coming along? He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had decided something in advance and was now simply enduring the formality of it. Coming along fine, he said. He glanced toward the Trent daughters across the room. If you'll excuse me, of course. The next one was Harold Briggs, who told her without much ceremony that he was looking for someone more settled, which they both understood to mean someone without Elena's particular inheritance of debt and damaged reputation. Then William Ossie, who was kinder about it, who actually looked sorry, but whose eyes kept cutting sideways toward his mother standing 10 feet away, and whose mother's expression communicated everything his words didn't. Then Nathan Crow, who didn't bother with an excuse at all, just shook his head once, brief and final, like he was declining a dish at dinner. 4 rejections, then 5, then 6. Elena kept her face arranged. This was the thing she'd learned, that the face was the one territory you could control when everything else was being taken from you. She smiled when she needed to smile and moved on when she needed to move on. And she held on to that composure like it was the last solid thing in a room that was slowly tilting. But by the 8th rejection, Thomas Grayburn, who was half drunk and still managed to make her feel beneath his consideration, something in her composure started to develop cracks that only she could feel. She stepped outside. The cold hit her like a flat hand, immediate and absolute. The sky was navy black and packed with stars, the kind of stars you only got this far north, this far from anything with electric lights. And they were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you're too tired to properly appreciate them. She stood on the frozen ground with her arms wrapped around herself and looked at the trees at the edge of the clearing and thought about her cabin 3 miles away, and the fire she'd have to rebuild when she got home, and the fact that there was nobody waiting for her when she did. This was the moment she was closest to it, to the thing that lives inside everyone who has been told often enough that they don't measure up, the voice that speaks in the language of accumulated evidence. Nobody wants you. Your father left. Your neighbors turned. 8 men, Elena. 8 men looked at you and chose not to. She pressed her lips together hard and stared at the stars and did not cry. After a while, she went back inside. She went back inside because going home would have meant something she wasn't willing to let it mean. She went back inside because she was not her father, who ran away from things. She would stand in this barn and endure every rejection this settlement had to offer, and she would walk out on her own 2 feet, and she would go home to her cold cabin, and she would rebuild her fire, and she would go to sleep. She just had to get through the rest of the evening. The 9th man was Caleb Dunmore. Caleb was the closest thing Iron Hollow had to a leading citizen under 50. He ran the general store, had taken over from his father 3 years ago, and had done well enough with it that he'd started to develop the particular confidence of a man who had never been genuinely uncertain about his place in the world. He was tall, moderately handsome, and socially fluent in a way that often got mistaken for warmth. He found her near the fiddler, who had finally worked himself into something that 2 or 3 couples were attempting to dance to. "Elena Cross," he said. "Wondered if you'd be here." "Here I am," she said, and kept her voice level. He studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something calculating in it, which was not inherently a problem. Most people in Iron Hollow were calculating. It was a survival trait. But there was something else too, something that made her slightly cautious in a way she couldn't articulate. "I'll be honest with you," he said. She waited. "You're a capable woman. Anyone can see that. You've kept that homestead running on nothing for 3 years, which is not nothing." He paused. "But my business depends on relationships in this community, the trust people have in my family." Another pause. "Your father's situation. I'm not saying it's your fault, but it's a complication. You understand?" "I understand," she said. Her voice came out completely flat. "Maybe in a few more years, if the memory of it has settled a bit more." "Thank you for being honest," she said, because she could not say what she actually wanted to say, and walked away before he could add anything else. She walked to the far corner of the barn near the door to the livestock area where nobody was standing, and she put one hand flat against the rough timber wall and breathed through her nose slowly, 3 times, 4 times, until the thing that was trying to rise in her chest went back down where she kept it. 9. She'd been rejected 9 times in one evening. There were not enough men left in the room for a 10th to matter much. She was going to leave. She had decided she was going to leave. She just needed another minute. Just one more minute to collect herself completely, to make sure she walked out of this barn looking like a woman who was leaving because she'd decided to leave, not because she'd been driven out. She was giving herself that minute when the barn doors opened, not the side door she'd come through. The main doors, the big double doors at the front of the barn that were usually kept closed against the cold. Both of them, swinging inward at once, and with them came a gust of winter air that made the lanterns gutter and caused every person in the room to turn toward the source. The man who walked through was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer physical fact of him. He stood 6'3" or 4", broad across the shoulders in a way that his coat, itself a massive thing made of oiled canvas, and what looked like wolf fur along the collar, made even broader. He wore a dark beard that had grown past the point of deliberate choice and entered the territory of simple necessity. Snow clung to his shoulders and the brim of his hat. He carried a pack on his back that would have buckled most men's knees. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the lantern light, and Elena watched the room react to him. The conversations didn't die exactly. They changed register, dropped in volume, became self-conscious. The fiddler lost his rhythm and found it again badly. She saw Margaret Haverford straighten almost imperceptibly. She saw the Osborne brothers, who were big men themselves, shift their weight in a way that was not quite stepping back but was somehow adjacent to it. Someone near Elena murmured something to their neighbor. She caught a word. Ashcroft. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew it, though most people's knowledge of Rowan Ashcroft was less knowledge than it was accumulated rumor. He'd been trapping the high country for how long? 8 years? 10? He came down to settlements occasionally for supplies, occasionally for trade, and then went back up into the mountains where, by all accounts, he'd built himself a life that didn't require other people in any meaningful way. The stories about him varied depending on who was telling them and what they'd had to drink. Some said he'd killed a man up north before coming to this territory, which probably wasn't true but persisted anyway. Some said he'd survived a winter alone on the high peaks that would have killed anyone else, which was probably true. Some said he talked to wolves, which was probably a function of the fact that he clearly wasn't interested in talking to people. What everyone seemed to agree on was that he was not social, was not interested in being social, and generally made other people's social instincts feel vaguely threatened, which made his presence at the gathering, at any gathering, genuinely puzzling. He crossed the barn without speaking to anyone, which caused people to step aside without quite knowing they were doing it, and he made his way to the table where Margaret Haverford had set up a small supply of the settlement's better whiskey. He poured himself a cup. He did not pour it the way men pour drinks at social occasions, with some performance of ease or conviviality. He poured it the way you'd pour water when you needed water. Practical, direct, done. Then he turned and looked at the room. She felt his gaze move past her, then come back. She didn't look away. This was partly stubbornness and partly simple lack of energy. She'd spent all her available social effort on the evening already and had none left for the performance of not noticing when someone noticed her. He looked at her for what felt like too long, but was probably 4 seconds. Then Margaret Haverford appeared at his elbow, because Margaret Haverford was constitutionally incapable of allowing anything to happen in her vicinity without her involvement. "Rowan Ashcroft," she said. "You actually came." "I said I would," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not rough, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from not using something unnecessarily. "I thought you'd change your mind." "I don't change my mind much." Margaret assessed him with the expression she used on everyone, which was to say no expression at all, but the sense of something moving behind her eyes. "You know how this works? The gathering?" "I know how it works." "You're looking for someone practical," you said. "That's right. I've got 3 girls from the Trent family, all capable, all good workers, all from solid families. I'm sure they are," he said, and his eyes moved across the room again and stopped. He was looking at Elena. She became aware of this not because she was watching him. She had deliberately looked away at some point in the last 30 seconds, because 4 seconds of eye contact with a stranger was enough, and she had her dignity. But because she felt it the way you feel a draft in a room that was previously still, a directional awareness. She looked back. He was already walking toward her. The path he took across the barn was not precisely direct. There were people in the way, and they moved, and he walked around those who didn't. But it was unhurried and purposeful, and it left absolutely no ambiguity about where he was going. Elena Cross watched this happen and felt something she could only describe later as the peculiar vertigo of the universe choosing an unexpected moment to shift on its axis. He stopped in front of her. Up close he was even larger than he'd looked across the barn, and the wolf fur collar of his coat was doing something that the lantern light made almost theatrical. But his face was not what the stories had led her to expect. She'd constructed from the rumors something harsh and brutal. What she found instead was a face marked by weather and time, with deep-set dark eyes that were doing something she found hard to categorize. Not gentle, not threatening. Present, in a way that most people's eyes were not. He looked at her hands first. This was so unexpected that she almost reacted to it visibly. She held the gloves in her left hand. She'd taken them off when she'd come back inside. And so her hands were bare, and he looked at them with a directness that should have felt invasive, but somehow didn't. Then he looked at her face. "You're Elena Cross," he said. "Yes," she said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "I heard your father had debts." "He did." "Are they paid?" The question hit her sideways, not because it was inappropriate. It was actually the most practical question anyone had asked her in 3 years, but because nobody ever asked it directly. They worked around it, referred to it obliquely, let it hang in the air between them like something that couldn't be named. He asked it the way you'd ask about the weather, factual, without malice. "Most of them," she said. 2 more years of what I'm making, and the rest are gone." He nodded, taking this in. "And the homestead? You're running it alone?" "Yes." "What do you grow?" "Enough." The corner of his mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, something adjacent. "How much is enough?" "Enough that I've been fed and housed for 3 years without borrowing from anyone," she said, and something in her voice had an edge to it that she hadn't entirely planned. "Which I suspect is more than most people expected from me." He looked at her for another moment. "It's more than most people manage with help," he said. It wasn't flattery. It was a statement. The difference was clear. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, because the conversation had a weight to it that she needed to address directly. "I'm not sure what you're doing over here, but if you're going to tell me about your concerns regarding my father's reputation, I'd appreciate it if you kept it brief. I've heard variations of it 8 times tonight, and I'm fairly tired." 9 times, he said. She blinked. What? I was at the door earlier. I heard Dunmore. She held his gaze and worked very hard to keep the heat from showing in her face. Then you know how the evening's gone. I know how the evening's gone, he agreed. He seemed to be considering something. There was a pause that had thought in it rather than discomfort. I don't have a concern about your father's reputation. All right, I have a proposal. That's a word people use here to mean several different things, she said carefully. I mean a working arrangement, he said. Partnership, equal terms. He said it without ceremony, without build-up, the way you'd propose a trade arrangement. I've got 40 acres up on the North Ridge, plus the cabin and outbuildings. Good land for what it is. Decent trapping territory. What I don't have is someone who can manage the homestead end of it, the garden, the preserving, the practical work. I spend too much time in the high country to do it right. She stared at him. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership, he said. Your work, my land and resources, shared decisions, shared output. A brief pause. And a legal arrangement so you're protected. Marriage, she said flatly. If you want to call it that, I'd call it a contract with practical benefits for both parties. She needed a moment to process this. She'd come to the gathering expecting the outcome she'd received, and then she'd been surprised by the presence of a stranger, and now the stranger was standing in front of her proposing something that was technically what the gathering was for, but was so different in every other way from anything she'd anticipated that she was having trouble sorting out what she thought about it. You don't know me, she said. I know enough. From looking at my hands. From looking at your hands and watching how you've moved through this room for the last 2 hours, he said. You went back outside around the midpoint. I saw you from the window when I arrived. You came back in. That tells me something. She opened her mouth and closed it again. What does it tell you? That you don't quit when things are difficult, he said. Which is the only thing I actually need to know. The fiddler found a new song. Somewhere to her left, a couple that had worked up enough courage was beginning to move in something that approximated a dance. The lantern swung slightly in a draft from the high windows. Elena Cross looked at the man standing in front of her. This large, weathered, deeply strange individual who had walked through a room full of people to come talk to her specifically, and ran through the calculus of her situation with the swift, unsentimental efficiency that 3 years of solo survival had given her. She was 24. She had a failing homestead, a dead father's debts, and a settlement full of people who had collectively decided what category she belonged in. She had 2 more years, maybe 3, of grinding work before she was financially clear, and even then she'd be building from essentially nothing, on land that wasn't rich, in a community that had already made up its mind about her. Or she could take the hand of a man she didn't know, go into the mountains she'd never been into, and build something different. The first option was known. The second option was uncertain in ways she couldn't fully calculate. These were not equivalent uncertainties. Going up into the high country with a stranger who talked to wolves, who had maybe killed a man, who looked at people the way other people looked at problems to be solved, that was a different category of risk than the slow, grinding, certain difficulty of staying where she was. But staying where she was had a different kind of certainty too. The certainty of diminishment. The certainty of being exactly what Iron Hollow had decided she was for the rest of her life. She'd come back into this barn tonight when the easier choice was to leave. The 40 acres, she said. What's the soil like? Something moved in his dark eyes. Not surprise, more like recognition. Thin on the east end, he said. Better on the south slope where the snow runs off early. Room for a proper garden if you know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing. I assumed, he said. The cabin, she said. How big? Big enough. I built it in sections. 2 main rooms plus a storage room and a loft. He paused. I'll build more if it's needed. And the agreement, she said. Equal terms. You said that. I said that. What does equal terms mean when one person owns the land? He considered this with the same directness he'd applied to everything else. It means shared decisions on anything that affects both of us. It means your labor gives you standing equal to the investment of the land. It means if this doesn't work and we part ways, you leave with half of what we've built together. Another pause. It means I don't give orders and expect obedience. I lay out what I know and I listen to what you know, and we figure out the rest. She looked at him steadily. That's not how most men around here think about marriage. I know, he said. That's why I've never done it before. She took a breath. The barn smelled of pine and candle and nervous people and the particular cold that kept seeping through the cracks in the walls. She was aware of people watching them from various corners of the room, pretending not to, aware of the weight of the evening and everything it had contained. I'll need a week, she said, to close up my homestead properly and settle what I owe the Hendersons for the feed I borrowed in October. He nodded. That's reasonable. And I'll need your word, she said, on the equal terms. Not just tonight. Permanent. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. A large hand scarred across the knuckles, calloused in the specific places that came from rope and cold and years of hard use. Then she took it. His grip was firm, without being performative, the grip of someone who shook hands the way they did everything else, with the precise amount of force the situation required, and no more. Rowan Ashcroft, he said. I know who you are, she said. Elena Cross. I know who you are, he said back. Across the barn, she saw Caleb Dunmore watching with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between surprise and something else, something less comfortable. She saw Margaret Haverford watching with an expression that was purely calculating. She saw two of the Trent girls with their heads together, whispering. She did not care. She took stock of this. She did not care what the room thought of this. This was new. For 3 years she had cared, carefully and exhaustingly, about managing the settlement's perception of her, because the settlement's perception of her had direct consequences for her survival. And now, in the span of a 2-minute conversation, she had stepped sideways out of that particular constraint, and the room could think whatever it wanted. They stood there for another moment, two strangers who had just made a binding decision in the middle of a barn dance. And then the fiddler's song ended, and the moment resolved into the ordinary world, and they moved apart. She stayed another hour. This was deliberate. She was not fleeing, and she was not hiding, and she was not going to behave like either was true. She drank a cup of the terrible coffee that someone had brewed in an iron pot on the small stove by the entrance. She exchanged brief conversations with 3 or 4 people who approached her with the particular curiosity of individuals who had just watched something unexpected happen and wanted to take a closer look. She answered their questions honestly and briefly and gave them nothing that could be turned into useful gossip. Rowan Ashcroft stayed on his side of the barn for the most part. He spoke to no one she could see except a brief exchange with Margaret Haverford, who was presumably getting whatever information she'd decided she needed. Once, from across the room, their eyes met for a moment and then moved on. When she finally left, through the front doors, not the side doors she'd arrived through, the cold hit her again. The stars were still there. The frozen ground still crunched under her boots. Her horse, reshoed by the Calloway's youngest son who'd had the tools and the goodwill, was waiting where she'd left it. She mounted up and rode back toward her homestead in the dark, the mountain peaks on the horizon black against a sky that had no moon. Her breath made clouds. The horse's breath made clouds. The world was very quiet out here, a mile from the barn and the lanterns and the noise. She had a week. She ran through the list of things that needed doing. The livestock would need to go. She couldn't take them up the mountain, and she could sell the 2 goats and the older of the hens to the Pelham family, who'd offered before. The kitchen tools were worth taking, the tools her father had left, the real ones, the axe and the adze, and the good handsaw. Those were worth taking. The furniture was rough enough that it wasn't worth the transport. The books. She would take the books. And the money she owed the Hendersons. That needed settling first before anything else. She was almost to the ridge when she realized she was running through a list of practical tasks instead of having the emotional reaction to the evening that probably warranted having. 8 men had rejected her. A 9th man she'd never met had offered her a partnership in the middle of all of it. She'd said yes to a stranger and was now planning to move to a mountain. She examined her internal state for the kind of fear or doubt or second-guessing that the situation seemed to warrant. She found something else instead. It was something close to relief. Not the warm, comfortable kind of relief, but the clean, cold, clarifying kind. The relief of a decision made and a direction chosen, of the uncertainty of the barn replaced by the concrete uncertainty of the mountains. She didn't know how this would go. She didn't know who Rowan Ashcroft actually was beneath the rumors and the silence, and the careful way he'd talked to her tonight. She didn't know what 40 acres on the North Ridge actually looked like, or what the cabin was actually like, or what a partnership with this particular man would actually require of her. But she knew herself. That was the one thing 3 years of hard living had given her beyond question. She knew exactly what she was capable of, and she knew she hadn't been using most of it. The homestead had kept her alive, but it hadn't asked enough of her. She'd been surviving at three-quarter capacity because surviving alone on thin land only demanded so much. She wanted to know what she was capable of when the situation demanded everything. The cabin came into view at the top of the ridge road, small and dark and waiting. The window glass black, the chimney cold. She'd build the fire back up. She'd eat something. She'd sleep. Tomorrow she'd start the list. She dismounted, led the horse into the small lean-to barn, and started unsaddling him by feel in the dark. "All right," she said quietly to the horse, or maybe to herself, or maybe to the whole silent mountain horizon that she was going to be living on in a week. "All right, The next 7 days were the busiest she could remember in recent years, which was saying something. The livestock negotiation with the Pelhams went smoothly enough. Samuel Pelham had wanted those goats for 2 seasons, and he paid fairly without much haggling, which she appreciated. The Henderson debt was settled in cash, which left her reserves thinner than she liked, but clean. Clean was what mattered. The sorting of the homestead's contents was the part that took the most out of her, not physically, but in some other way that she was careful not to examine too closely. 3 years in this cabin. She'd moved in when she was 21, and everything was in ruins, and she'd made it functional through a combination of stubbornness and necessity, and she'd made it into something that was, within its limitations, hers. Setting that aside wasn't easy. She packed what mattered and left what didn't, and didn't allow herself to linger over it. On the morning of the 7th day, Rowan arrived with a horse and a sledge at first light, which was when she'd told him to come, and which she'd said mostly as a test of whether he would actually do it or whether she'd have to send word up to the mountain. He arrived 10 minutes before the light actually came, which suggested he'd left in the dark, which suggested he took her at her word. She marked this. He didn't say much. She didn't say much. They loaded the sledge in the gray pre-dawn light, working with the efficient economy of 2 people who both understood what needed doing and didn't need to discuss it. When the cabin was emptied of everything she was taking, she stood in the doorway for one last moment, looking at the bare interior. The rough walls her father had built badly, the floor she'd re-leveled herself, the window she'd reglazed in the first winter, the hearth she'd used 10,000 times. "Ready?" Rowan said from behind her, not pushing, just asking. "Yes," she said, and stepped out. She didn't look back. Not because she wasn't allowed to, but because she'd decided not to, and that decision was hers, and it was enough. The road north and upward climbed for nearly 4 hours. The mountains came closer and then became the thing they were traveling through, rather than the thing they were looking at. The trees changed, the thin settlement pines giving way to old growth, massive trees that had been here before anyone in Iron Hollow had been born and would be here after. The air changed, too. It got cleaner in a way that was almost aggressive, so much oxygen it felt like more than the lungs knew what to do with at first. Rowan spoke occasionally, pointing out landmarks or trail conditions, giving her information without commentary. She listened and asked specific questions when she had them. Around midday, he said, "The last mile is steep. The horse will manage it, but it'll be slow." "All right," she said. "The south slope will be the first place the snow clears in spring," he said. "You can get an early start on the ground prep." She looked at him. He was riding slightly ahead, watching the trail. "You've been thinking about the garden," she said. "I thought about the practical things." "So did I," she said. He glanced back at her. "What did you decide to bring?" "The books, the kitchen tools, my father's woodworking tools, and about 40 pounds of stored seed I've been saving for 3 years waiting for better land to put it in." He held her gaze for a moment. "Good," he said, and turned back to the trail. It wasn't much, but from him, she was beginning to understand it was enough. The cabin appeared when the trail crested the last ridge, and the trees opened up into a cleared space that was larger than she'd expected. An acre, maybe more, of cut-back land against the mountain's southern face, catching whatever winter sun made it this far north. And in the center of it, set back toward the tree line on the north side where the worst wind would be broken, the cabin. It was nothing like what she'd built up in her imagination during the 7 days of preparation. She'd expected something rough, something that communicated the man's solitary nature, functional, stark, without consideration of anything beyond the practical minimum. What she found was still rough, still clearly built for function first, but substantial in a way that surprised her. The logs were large and well fitted, the gaps chinked with obvious care. The roof was steeply pitched, which was right for snow load, and she could see from here that it had been recently redone, new wood showing at the edges. There was a porch, not decorative, but a genuine covered work area along the south face, running nearly the full length of the cabin. Storage buildings behind, well built, a well house, a root cellar entrance set into the slope. He'd built this over years, piece by piece, expansion by expansion, returning from the high country each season and adding to it. The structure was the record of a decade of deliberate, patient work by a man who intended to stay somewhere and took that intention seriously. She sat on her horse and looked at it. "South Slope is behind the main cabin," he said. "I cleared it 2 summers ago but didn't do anything with it. Thought maybe someday I'd—" He stopped. "Put a garden there," she said. "Something like that." She looked at him. He was looking at the cabin, not at her, with an expression she was starting to be able to read. The particular stillness of a man who had more going on internally than he was putting into words. He'd been thinking about this for 2 summers. He'd cleared land and then not used it because the thing he needed to use it for was someone who knew what to do with it. She filed this away. "It's good land," she said. "The clearing and the slope and the aspect. Whoever cleared it made a good decision." A very slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "That's kind of you," he said. "I wasn't being kind," she said. "I was being accurate." Now he did look at her, and there was something in his dark eyes that was— She catalogued it carefully, because she was already learning that his face was a text worth reading carefully. Something that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, and something else that she thought might be the very early beginning of respect. "Well," he said, "welcome to the North Ridge." She took a breath of the cold mountain air, clean and sharp, and absolutely indifferent to everything she'd left behind in the valley. "Thank you," she said. And then she dismounted, tied the horse, and went to look at her new home. The first morning on the North Ridge, Elena woke up before light and didn't know where she was. It lasted only a second, that lurching, disoriented moment between sleep and waking where the brain scrambles to reassemble the world. But in that second, she reached for the familiar weight of her old cabin and found something entirely different. Higher ceiling, different smell. The sound of wind moving through old-growth trees rather than the thin settlement pines she'd listened to for 3 years. And cold. A different quality of cold than she was used to, deeper and more serious. The kind that meant business even through the thick walls. Then it came back to her. All of it. The barn, the rejections, the man who'd walked through the doors, the 7 days of packing and settling and not looking back, the 4-hour ride up the mountain and the cabin appearing through the trees, bigger and more substantial than she'd expected. The quiet of the first evening, when they'd unloaded the sledge and he'd shown her the storage arrangements, and she'd organized her seed supply in the root cellar with the methodical focus of someone who needed to do something concrete and familiar. She was on the North Ridge. This was her life now. She lay there for another 30 seconds, cataloging the strangeness of it. Then she got up. The main room was cold but not brutal. Rowan had banked the fire before turning in, and the coals were still alive enough that with some careful work and dry kindling from the box beside the hearth, she had it going again in 10 minutes. She found the coffee things where he'd pointed them out the night before. She started water heating and looked out the south-facing window at the dark that was just beginning, at its eastern edge, to think about becoming something else. She was standing at the window with her hands wrapped around a cup when she heard movement from the other room. He appeared in the doorway with his boots already on and his coat half-fastened, which told her he'd woken up and dressed with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd spent years starting his days in the dark and cold and had no patience for the process. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they looked at each other across the dim room, 2 people still figuring out the basic grammar of sharing a space. "Coffee's hot," she said. He moved to the stove and poured a cup and drank half of it standing up before he said anything. "Sleep all right?" "Fine," she said, which was mostly true. The loft was functional, a rope bed, a decent mattress that he'd apparently stuffed with fresh pine needles at some point in the recent past, 2 heavy wool blankets. She'd been warm enough and exhausted enough that the strangeness of the place hadn't kept her up long. "You?" "Same as always," he said. She didn't know what that meant and filed it away for later. They ate breakfast without much conversation. Dried meat and the last of the cornbread she'd brought from her homestead with the coffee. And then she asked him to walk her through the property properly, not the brief orientation from the night before, but a real accounting. He looked at her with a slight pause, like he was recalibrating something, and then said, "All right." They spent the better part of the morning in the cold, moving through the cleared land and the outbuildings and the tree line and back. He talked more than she expected him to, once he understood she was asking specific questions and wanted specific answers rather than a general tour. The south slope was indeed better than the east ground, better drainage, earlier snowmelt, better sun angle in the growing months. The root cellar was deep and well constructed but needed new shelving on the east wall, which she said she could do, and he looked at her again with that particular pause before nodding. The trapping territory extended north and east, up into the high country where she hadn't been and wouldn't be going in winter. He explained the general range and the cycle, the long weeks in the high country during trapping season, the return periods, the rhythm of the year as he lived it. He was matter-of-fact about it. He was also, she noticed, telling her things she'd need to know if she was ever here without him, which was the approach of a man who thought about practical contingencies rather than comfortable assumptions. "How long are the long trips?" she asked. 3 weeks? Sometimes 4? "And you go alone?" "Always have." She looked at the tree line, the dark mass of old growth that began where the cleared land ended and went up the mountain until the trees stopped and the rocks started. "What happens if something goes wrong up there?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then something goes wrong," he said. It wasn't meant to be bleak. He said it the way you'd state a fact about gravity, not dismissively, but with the flat acceptance of someone who'd made his peace with the real odds of the life he'd chosen. She found she didn't want to push past it. She understood it in her own way. 3 years on a failing homestead alone had given her a version of the same accounting. "I want to learn the near territory," she said, "within a half-day's walk. Not the high country, just enough that I know the land I'm living on." He considered this. "Spring would be better for that. Spring will be putting in the garden, and I won't have time. I want to start now." Another pause. She was starting to understand his pauses. They weren't hesitation so much as actual consideration. He didn't say things until he'd thought them through, which was both reassuring and occasionally maddening. "I'll take you out this week," he said, "before the next storm system." "Thank you." He looked at her with the faint expression she was beginning to identify as something between surprise and something warmer, though she wasn't ready to name what. "You don't have to thank me for practical things," he said. "This is your land, too." It was a small thing, but she felt it land somewhere significant. The first 2 weeks were hard in the specific way that learning is hard. Not painful exactly, but relentlessly demanding in terms of attention and adjustment. Everything was different from what she knew. The altitude changed the cooking times, which she hadn't accounted for, and burned 2 batches of beans discovering. The wood he kept was different from the settlement wood she was used to, harder, denser, slower to catch, and hotter once burning, and her fire management instincts needed recalibrating. The water came from a spring-fed line he'd run to the cabin, which was ingenious and almost always reliable, except when it wasn't, when she had to learn the process for clearing the intake on the hillside in freezing temperatures. She didn't complain about any of this. Complaining required an audience that was interested in your difficulties, and she'd learned long ago that most audiences weren't. She also didn't ask for help when she could figure things out herself, which was most of the time, though it took longer. What she didn't expect was how closely he paid attention. Not in an intrusive way. He wasn't watching her, wasn't hovering. He had his own work, substantial and constant, and he did it with the absorbed focus of a man who'd been self-sufficient for long enough that it was simply how he existed. But he noticed things. On the 3rd day, without comment, a different size of pot appeared on the hook near the hearth, smaller than the one she'd been wrestling with, better sized for the quantities she was cooking. On the fifth day, a small piece of equipment she'd been improvising a substitute for was simply present on the workbench, placed there without explanation. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. It was just there. She started paying attention to him in return. He was quieter than any person she'd spent sustained time with, but it wasn't the silence of someone who had nothing going on. When he was working on something, repairing equipment, processing pelts, the dozen practical tasks that the homestead required, there was a quality of presence to him that she found herself watching sometimes without meaning to. He had patience for difficult things, real patience, the kind that came from genuinely not being bothered by the time something took. He also had a temper, which she discovered on the 9th day. She'd been reinforcing the east wall shelving in the root cellar, and he'd come to check on something in the storage, and he'd seen what she was doing and stopped. "That bracket's not going to hold," he said. "It'll hold fine," she said. She'd been building and repairing things for 3 years. She knew what she was doing. The wood's old on that section, dry rot under the surface. Put weight on that bracket and the whole thing comes out. I checked the wood. "Elena." His voice had a particular quality she hadn't heard yet. Not loud, but with a flatness to it that indicated the matter was not open. "I'm not arguing about it. The wood is bad." She stopped. She looked at the bracket and the wall and the small signs she'd missed. The grain of the wood doing something subtle that she should have caught. She'd been working fast and she hadn't looked carefully enough, and he was right. She hated being wrong in front of people. She'd always hated it. It went back further than the last 3 years, back to being her father's daughter and needing to be beyond reproach in everything just to be taken at face value. Being wrong felt like exposure. "Fine," she said, and started pulling the bracket back out. "Where's the better lumber?" He stood there for another second, like he was bracing for something that didn't happen. Then, "Back of the storage building. I'll show you." They redid the bracket together in silence. It took 40 minutes. When it was done, it was solid, the kind of solid that would last 20 years. And she felt the specific satisfaction of a problem properly solved, which was different from the prickly defensiveness of having been corrected. "Thank you," she said, "for the wood." "The bracket design is good," he said. "You were right about the weight distribution." She looked at him. "You don't have to give me that." "I know," he said. "It's accurate." And he left to go back to what he'd been doing. She stood in the root cellar for a moment after he'd gone, with the smell of cold earth and preserved food around her, and thought that she might need to recalibrate her understanding of what living with this particular man was going to look like. The 3rd week brought the weather. It didn't announce itself dramatically. The sky went flat and white over 2 days, the kind of flat white that people who'd lived at altitude knew meant something substantial was building. Rowan had been planning a short supply run to the lower settlement, not Iron Hollow, which was still a direction she wasn't ready to go, but a smaller trading post 2 hours' ride south, and he'd looked at the sky on the second morning and decided against it. "How long?" she asked. 2 days. Maybe 3. He was moving around the cabin checking things in a methodical sweep that told her he'd done this many times. "We're stocked well enough. It's manageable." "I wasn't worried," she said. He glanced at her. "I know," he said. The storm came in that night, and it was not gentle. Wind came down from the peaks with a force that made the cabin walls creak in ways that initially alarmed her, and then, when the walls held and continued holding, became almost a background sound, something she moved through rather than reacted to. Snow came horizontally for most of the first day, the kind of snow that reduced visibility to a few feet and made the cleared land around the cabin disappear entirely. They were inside together for almost 3 days. She hadn't fully thought through what this would mean, practically. Sharing the space during the working hours of the day was one thing. Sharing it for 3 days straight, with nowhere to go and nothing to look at but the storm, was something else. She'd lived alone for 3 years, and before that she'd lived with a father who was more absent than present even when he was there. The idea of another person continuously, in every hour of the day, was something she didn't entirely have a template for. She dealt with it by working. There was always work. Mending, organizing, the small repairs and improvements she'd been making notes about since arriving. She set up a proper workspace at the table near the south window and went through her seed inventory for the 3rd time, mapping out what she wanted to do with the south slope in spring, making plans on paper because it gave the waiting somewhere to go. He worked too. He had pelts to process and equipment to maintain, and he spent one entire afternoon sharpening every blade in the cabin with a focus that would have been almost frightening if she hadn't started to recognize it as simply how he engaged with tasks. But they also, inevitably, talked, not all at once. It happened in pieces, in the spaces between work, over the meals she cooked, and he ate without complaint, and occasionally with something she was starting to recognize as actual appreciation. It happened in the evening of the first storm day, when the wind was loudest and neither of them was pretending to work anymore, just sitting near the fire, her with a book and him with nothing. And he said out of nowhere, "What do you actually know about trapping?" She looked up. "Enough to know it's harder than people in the settlements think." "What do you know specifically?" "Snares and deadfalls, basic stuff. I trapped rabbits some winters when I needed to." She paused. "I know skins, but not the full processing. I know the seasons on some animals, not all." He looked at the fire. "I'll teach you the rest." "Why?" He seemed to consider the question as actually worth considering rather than rhetorical. "Because if you're living on this mountain, you should know how it works," he said. "All of it, not just the homestead side." "Most men would keep that knowledge separate," she said. "Keep the dependency." "I'm not interested in your dependency," he said, with a flatness that indicated this was simply true, not a position he was performing. She turned this over. "What are you interested in?" He looked at her then, a direct look that she'd learned to hold without flinching. "Someone who can be relied on," he said. "Someone who does what they say they'll do, knows what they know, and admits what they don't." A pause. "I've lived alone for a long time. I'm not good at the parts of living with people that require certain things." "What things?" "The softness," he said, as if the word was foreign. "The talking around things, the managing feelings." He stopped. "I'll tell you the truth. I'll do what I say I'll do. I'll be here. What I won't do is perform things I don't feel." She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and settled. "I don't need you to perform anything," she said. "I've had enough of people performing things. My father performed being reliable for 15 years. I'd rather have someone who's honest about what they are." He looked back at the fire. Something in his shoulders settled in a fractional way that she noted without commenting on. "My mother used to say I came out of the womb already wanting to be left alone," he said, which surprised her because it was the first personal thing he'd offered without being asked. Did she mean it as a criticism? He thought about it. "Sometimes," he said. "Other times she just meant it as the truth." "Where is she now?" "Gone. Long time ago." She nodded. Did not push past it. He'd gone as far as he'd meant to go with that. "My father used to say I was too serious," she offered back, not because she felt obligated to match him, but because it seemed like the right thing to put into the space. He meant it as a criticism every time. He wanted me to be lighter, more forgiving of his particular brand of chaos. "Were you?" "No," she said. "I was right not to be." Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same general direction. "Yes," he said, "you were." The second storm day was physically harder than the first. The cold had intensified overnight, dropped another 15 degrees at least, and maintenance of the cabin's temperature became a real task rather than a background one. She took over the fire management completely and did it well, keeping the temperature stable through careful attention to the wood and the drafts. And he watched her do it once and then didn't watch her do it again, which she understood as a form of confidence. They also had their first genuine argument that day. It started over firewood, specifically over whether she should go out to the woodpile, which was covered and stacked along the porch, or whether the indoor reserve was sufficient for another 24 hours. "We're fine," he said. "Don't go out in this." "The indoor reserve is getting low. If the storm runs another day, we'll be in trouble." "I'll go out." "Why you?" "Because I know how fast conditions can change on this mountain, and you don't." She felt the familiar heat of being managed. "I've been in bad winters before." "Not at this altitude. The cold is different. The wind is different. 20 feet from the porch and you can lose your orientation completely." "Then I'll tie off," she said. "I'll run a line from the porch ring to the woodpile." He stared at her. "You know about tie-off lines. I'm not from somewhere warm, she said. I've been managing a homestead in hard winters for 3 years. I know about tie-off lines. The porch ring might not be anchored enough. Then anchor it better, she said, and I'll go get the wood. The silence between them had weight in it. She held it without backing down, not because she was being stubborn for its own sake, but because she was genuinely right and she knew it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to manage his comfort with the situation. You've got more range of motion in this coat than mine, he said finally, which was his way of conceding without using the word concede. You'll move faster. Yes, she said simply. He anchored the porch ring himself, drove 2 additional spikes into the timber with a force that indicated he was doing something with his frustration that wasn't putting it into words. And she ran the line and went out and got the wood. 3 trips. The cold was ferocious, genuinely different from anything she'd experienced before, a cold that didn't just affect the skin, but seemed to be interested in getting inside your actual thinking. She moved fast and kept the line in her hand and was back inside in under 20 minutes with enough wood for 2 days. He didn't say anything when she came back in. He handed her a cup of something hot and didn't ask how it had been, and she appreciated both of these things. That night, the storm still going but quieter now, the worst of it having said what it needed to say, she was reading at the table, and he was doing something with a piece of leather equipment at the other end, and he said without looking up, "You're better at this than I thought you'd be." She looked up from her book. "What exactly did you think I'd be?" He was quiet for a second in the way of someone choosing words. "The gathering," he said. "The way you looked when I first saw you. I thought competent, determined, but the mountain has its own category of hard. I wasn't sure." He glanced up briefly. "I should have been." She looked at him for a moment. She took the measure of it honestly, more than she'd expected him to offer. "Why did you come to the gathering?" she asked. "Really? You don't go to settlement events. Everyone said so." He returned to the leather. His hands kept working. He did everything better when his hands were busy, she'd noticed. "Margaret Haverford wrote me a letter in October," he said. "Said she'd have my head if I didn't start thinking about the practical future. Said I was going to die alone in the high country and nobody would find me until spring." A pause. "She's not wrong. So you went." "I went. And you walked across the room to me. You were the only one in that barn who looked like she'd actually survive," he said, with such complete matter-of-factness that she had to take a moment to process it as the statement, "it was," rather than a social grace. "That's a very practical reason to choose someone," she said. "It's the most important reason," he said. "Everything else can be learned or worked out or gotten used to. Whether someone can actually survive, that's not something you can build from scratch." She sat with this. Outside, the wind shifted and dropped another notch. The storm was winding down. By morning, she thought, it would probably be done. "Rowan," she said. He looked up. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you chose right." He held her gaze for a moment. In the firelight, his eyes were dark and still and doing that thing she'd noticed from the first night in the barn. That quality of genuine presence, of actually being in the moment he was in rather than elsewhere. "So did you," he said, and went back to the leather. When the storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day, she was the first one outside. The world was white and remade, the trees bowed under snow, the cleared land smooth and blank as fresh paper. The air was cold enough to make breathing feel like drinking something. The sky had gone from flat white to a pale, clear blue that she'd never seen at this altitude before, a blue with depth to it, a blue that went all the way up. She stood on the porch and looked at it and felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not happiness exactly, though it wasn't far from happiness. More like the sensation of being in exactly the right place, which was something she couldn't remember feeling before. Not in the settlement, not in her father's house before that. A sense of fit between herself and the ground she was standing on. She heard the door open behind her. He came and stood beside her, looking at the same sky. "South Slope will need clearing after this," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll start this afternoon." He nodded. They stood there for another moment in the cold, watching the pale blue go deeper as the sun came up behind the peaks. Neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying. Then they went in and she made breakfast and they started the next day. It was still a long way from anything she'd call easy, but it was beginning to feel, in the careful and provisional way of real things rather than hoped-for things, like it might become something she'd actually chosen rather than something that had happened to her. That was enough for now. The weeks after the storm settled into a rhythm that Elena hadn't anticipated. Not comfortable exactly, but functional in the way that a good tool is functional, worn to fit the hand that uses it. January on the North Ridge was a different creature entirely from January in the valley. Down in Iron Hollow, winter was something you endured in proximity to other people. The cold made bearable by the simple fact of community, of shared fires and borrowed cups of sugar, and the knowledge that a neighbor was 20 yards away if something went wrong. Up here, winter was the whole world. It sat on the mountain like something that had always been there and intended to stay. And you either learned to work inside its terms or you didn't work at all. Elena learned. She learned which mornings required the heaviest gear before stepping outside and which were cold but manageable. She learned the sound the wind made in the high timber when a temperature drop was coming versus when it was just blowing for the sake of blowing. She learned the spring-fed water line's particular temperament, the way it slowed before it froze, giving maybe 2 hours of warning if you were paying attention, and she was always paying attention now. She mapped the near territory the way Rowan had promised to show her, in 4 separate half-day walks through the January cold, with him pointing out landmarks and trail markers and the places where the terrain did something unexpected, where a ridge looked navigable from a distance and revealed a drop on the other side. He was a good teacher when he decided to teach, which she hadn't expected. She'd braced for impatience, for the particular frustration of someone who had internalized skills so deeply they'd forgotten the steps and now had to excavate them for someone else's benefit. Some people couldn't do it. The knowledge became automatic and then became invisible and then became impossible to transfer. Rowan was not this way. He was precise. He said a thing once, clearly, and then watched to see if she'd gotten it. And if she hadn't, he found a different way to say it, rather than repeating the first version louder. This was rarer than it should have been, in her experience. Most of what keeps you alive up here is paying attention, he told her on the second walk, standing at the edge of a tree line where the snow had a different texture, wind-packed and hard, than the snow 30 feet back. Not strength, not experience, not yet, just noticing things. I've been noticing things my whole life, she said. Then you're ahead of most people who come up here. Do many people come up here? No, he said. That's the point. She spent the evenings doing what needed doing, mending, planning, the endless small maintenance work of a homestead. And he spent them the same way, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and she was genuinely surprised by how little the silence bothered her. She'd thought she might miss conversation more than she did. She'd thought the isolation might press against her in ways she hadn't accounted for. But the days were full enough that the evenings felt earned, and there was something about the quality of the quiet with him that was different from the quality of quiet when she'd been alone in the valley cabin. That quiet had been empty. This one had weight to it, presence, the sound of another person breathing and moving and existing on the other side of the room. She didn't examine this too carefully. There were things worth examining and things better left alone to develop at their own pace. February came and the cold peaked and then, almost imperceptibly, began its long retreat. It was in the first week of February that she made a mistake with the livestock. Rowan had 2 horses, 1 working horse, 1 spare, and 3 goats that lived in the small barn attached to the cabin's north side. The goats were her particular responsibility now, which she'd taken on without being asked because it was obvious, and because she was better at the daily management than he was. He fed them, and they were alive. But the nuances of their health and temperament were things he tracked the way you'd track an item on a list, rather than the way Elena tracked them, which was by feel. One of the goats, the oldest one, a brown and white animal with a badly healed old injury to her left foreleg and a personality like a suspicious grandmother, started going off her feed in the first week of February. Elena noticed on the second day. She adjusted the feeding, separated her from the other 2, checked for obvious signs of illness. On the 4th day, the goat was worse. She told Rowan that evening. How bad? He said. Bad enough that I'd want a vet if there were one, she said. There's something in her gut, the way she's holding herself. Could be the winter hay. The last bale from the Henderson order was damp when it came. I thought that too. I've got her on the older stock. She paused. I don't know if it's enough. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. What do you need? I need whatever you know about sick animals at altitude, she said, and I need to know where you keep the medical supplies. He showed her. The medical kit for the animals was better stocked than she'd expected, another sign of a man who thought in contingencies. She spent the next 3 days doing what she could, which was attentive nursing rather than medicine, keeping the goat warm and hydrated and quiet. Rowan checked in morning and evening, asked specific questions, and deferred to her judgment, which cost him something she could tell, because he was not a man who easily deferred, but he did it because she knew more in this particular area, and they both knew it. The goat lived, eventually, cantankerously, as if offended by the whole experience. You've got good instincts with animals, he said on the morning the goat finally ate a full portion. My mother was good with them, she said, and then was surprised she'd said it, because she didn't talk about her mother often. Her mother had died when Elena was 11, which was long enough ago that the grief had converted itself into something less acute, but the mention of her still arrived with unexpected weight sometimes. Rowan noticed the shift in her face the way he noticed most things, quietly and without making a production of it. She was a rancher, a farmer. She knew everything about keeping things alive with not enough of what they needed. Elena looked at the goat, who was investigating her feeding bucket with renewed hostility toward the world. I think she'd have liked it up here. She sound like you, he said. No, Elena said. I sound like her. She paused. There's a difference. He looked at her with that particular steady attention. What's the difference? She chose it, Elena said. She chose the hard life on purpose, when she could have chosen something easier. I chose it too, but I had help getting backed into the corner first. A pause. She was braver than me. That's not how I'd look at it, he said. I know, she said, but it's how I look at it. He didn't argue. She had noticed he didn't argue with her about how she saw things, which was different from agreeing with her. He stated his own position and left hers standing. She appreciated this more than she could easily articulate. The night it happened was in the 3rd week of February. He'd been planning the trip for a week, a trapping circuit through the near high country, not the deep wilderness runs that came in late winter, but a 3-day loop through the territory closest to the cabin to check lines and reset traps before the season shifted. He'd done it the previous 2 years at the same time. He'd explained the route to her with the usual precision, marked the trail on the rough map he kept tacked above the work table, told her what to expect regarding his return. He left on a Tuesday morning in clear weather, sky hard blue and cold, the kind of day that looked friendly until you were in it. She watched him ride out through the gate in the tree line and then turned back to the cabin and started the day. The first 2 days were fine. She worked the homestead, checked the animals, made plans for the south slope that she'd now walked a dozen times in the snow and could close her eyes and map from memory. She was not lonely in the way she'd expected to be lonely. She was busy, which was the same thing as being all right. The 3rd day started wrong. She noticed it when she woke. Something in the air pressure, a heaviness that she'd learned to read in the weeks since coming to the mountain. She went out at first light and looked north toward the high country where he was, and the sky had a color to it that she didn't like. Not the flat white of a storm building slowly. Something faster. Something angrier. She went through the day with that unease running underneath everything she did, a low-frequency wrongness that she couldn't dismiss because she'd learned up here that her instincts about the mountain's weather were getting better every week, and she trusted them now. He'd said he'd be back by late afternoon on the 3rd day. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the color of old iron, and the wind had started from the northwest with the particular intentionality of something that had decided. By the time the light began to fail, early, the clouds eating the sun from the west, he wasn't back. She stoked the fire to its highest. She put water on. She checked the barn animals and made sure everything was secured. She told herself he knew this mountain better than anyone, that he'd been through worse, that late was not the same as lost. She sat at the table by the window and watched the dark come down and the first snow start, and she held on to being calm by the specific effort of will it required. The storm hit fully around 9 in the evening. He came through the door at 9:20, and her first relief at hearing the sound of the latch lasted exactly as long as it took her to see him. He was holding the door frame with one hand. His coat was dark across the left shoulder and down the front, and it took her a half second to understand that the dark was blood, enough blood to matter, soaked through the thick canvas in a way that meant it had been going for a while. He was upright, which spoke to the specific category of his stubbornness, but only barely. There was something in how his weight was distributed that told her he was using more effort than he was showing. "Wolves," he said, because apparently the first order of business was explanation. South Pack moved earlier than they should have. 3 of them. "Sit down," she said. She was already moving. The horse can wait. Sit down." He looked at her with an expression she didn't have time to categorize and let her take his arm and guide him to the chair nearest the fire. Up close, the damage was worse than the first look. The coat had taken some of it. The thick canvas had slowed what would otherwise have been much worse. But the left shoulder and upper arm were badly torn, and there was a secondary wound along his right side that he'd been protecting without obviously showing it. "How long ago?" she said, already going for the medical kit. 2 hours. Maybe a little more. He was breathing carefully, the controlled breathing of someone managing real pain by keeping the body's responses in check. "I got back to the horse fast enough. The bleeding slowed." "It hasn't slowed enough." She brought the kit to the table. Her hands were steady, which she noted with a distant, practical part of her brain. She was afraid, but the fear was underneath the tasks that needed doing, and the tasks were what mattered right now. "I need to get the coat off." Getting the coat off was not simple. It had stiffened in the cold, and the blood had done something to the fabric, and moving the left arm caused a sharp intake of breath from him that he immediately controlled, but that she heard anyway. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry, keep going." "I'm fine," he said through his teeth. "You're not fine. Don't waste energy telling me you are." He was quiet after that, which was its own form of cooperation. What she found when she got the coat and shirt away was bad, but not unsurvivable, which she took 30 seconds to honestly assess before she let herself think anything else. The shoulder wound was the worst. Claw or bite, she couldn't entirely tell. The edges ragged in the way that animal wounds always were. The kind of damage that was going to need closing or infection would find its way in. The side wound was shallower. Painful, probably deeply painful, but not into anything vital. "You're going to need stitches," she said. "I know," he said. "I've stitched animals," she said, "not people." "Same principle," he said. She looked at him. His face was pale under the weathering and the beard, and there was sweat at his hairline despite the fact that he'd just come in from bitter cold, which told her about his pain levels more accurately than anything he'd said. "This is going to hurt badly," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "I know," he said again. "Do it." She'd closed wounds on animals, on goats with fence injuries, on her old plow horse's leg that first terrible winter in the valley. She knew the mechanics. She knew how to clean a wound properly, how to hold an edge together, how to put a stitch in that would hold. She'd never done it on a person. The scale was different. The consequences of getting it wrong were different. She didn't let herself think about the consequences. She thought about the steps. The cleaning took 20 minutes, and she didn't rush it, even when he went very still and very quiet in the way that meant she was causing significant pain. She used everything in the kit that was meant for this, and she used her judgment about what the wound needed over what the kit instructions said, because the kit instructions were for basic field dressing, and this was past that. "Talk to me," she said at one point, not because she needed conversation, but because she needed to know he was staying alert. "About what?" he said, through a jaw that was working to stay loose. "Anything. Tell me about the wolves." A pause. "South Pack usually runs lower in February," he said. His voice was effortful but coherent, which was what she needed. "They've been shifting their range for 2 seasons, moving up earlier each year. I should have accounted for it." Another pause. "That's on me." "Where were you when they came?" "Near the upper line. I heard them before I saw them. That was the only thing in my favor. I got to a rock outcrop fast enough to put my back against something." He stopped for a moment. She was starting the stitching, and the stopping was because of that, and she worked quickly and steadily and didn't ask him to keep talking for the next few minutes. When she tied off the first set, he exhaled slowly. 3 of them, he said, picking up where he'd left off, like the conversation had simply been paused rather than interrupted by the worst kind of pain. "The big male got my shoulder before I got my knife out. The other 2 were younger. They pulled back when I hit the male." "The male," she said. "Did you?" "No," he said. I wasn't trying to. Just made him decide I wasn't worth the cost. A pause. Wolves are practical. They're not mean. They just do their accounting. She started on the side wound, which was simpler. Her hands had found a steadiness she hadn't entirely planned for. The steadiness of necessity, of being the only person available to do something that had to be done. You rode 2 hours like this, she said. The alternative was staying out in whatever that sky was building, he said. That wasn't a question, she said. She stopped. She'd been about to say something that would come out wrong. She adjusted. I was just accounting for the timeline. He turned his head slightly to look at her, as much as he could from the angle he was at. His eyes, even now, had that quality of full attention. You were worried, he said. Of course I was worried. He was quiet for a moment. I don't usually have someone to worry, he said. It came out with a particular care, like he was handling something that could break. She tied off the last stitch and cut the thread and pressed a clean cloth against the wound with the necessary pressure, and she didn't say anything for a moment because she was occupied and because what he'd said needed a minute. Well, she said finally, you do now. She got him settled near the fire with blankets and the careful management of his position. He couldn't lie flat, not with the shoulder, and working out how to prop him so he could rest without putting weight on the wounds took 3 tries, and his increasingly minimal cooperation because he was fading, finally, into the exhaustion he'd been holding back for hours. She got water into him, which required more insistence than it should have. She made broth from what she had and got most of it into him. She checked his temperature with the back of her hand to his forehead, which was not scientific but was what she had, and found him warm but not alarmingly so. She sat in the chair across from him and watched him fall asleep, which happened with the abrupt totality of a man whose body had finally decided it was done cooperating. Outside, the storm was at its full height. The wind was doing things to the cabin roof that she'd catalog and inspect in the morning. The world beyond the walls was nothing but snow and dark and cold. She should sleep. She knew she should sleep. She'd need her full capacity tomorrow and every day after while he recovered, and her full capacity required rest. She told herself this with the clarity of someone who understood the logic completely. She didn't sleep. She sat in the chair and watched him breathe. The rise and fall of his chest, slow and even, once he'd fully gone under. And she let herself feel, now that there was nothing else to do, the full weight of the last several hours. The cold fact of what she'd found when he came through the door. The 2 hours of work with her hands in the kind of damage that no amount of previous experience fully prepares you for. The stitches she'd put in a man's body with a kit designed for emergencies, and her own nerve. She looked at her hands in the firelight, her hands that the settlement had noted as scarred and marked by labor, her hands that the barn full of men had looked at and decided told a discouraging story about her. She thought about what they'd actually done tonight. She got up around 2 in the morning to check his wounds, carefully and quietly, not wanting to wake him. The bleeding had truly stopped now, the stitching holding the way good stitching held. His temperature was stable. He was sleeping deeply. She pulled the blankets back into position and stood over him for a moment in the firelight. This large and difficult and unexpectedly decent man who had walked across a barn full of people to talk to her specifically, who had taught her the mountain's language one careful lesson at a time, who had said, I don't usually have someone to worry, with the particular naked honesty of someone unaccustomed to admitting that something mattered to them. He'd be all right. She knew it now with the settled certainty of having done every right thing and found nothing alarming in the results. He'd be in pain for weeks. The shoulder would take the longest. But he was going to be all right. She went back to her chair and added wood to the fire and wrapped herself in the second blanket she'd put by earlier without planning to use it herself. And she sat through the rest of the night while the storm had its say outside, keeping watch on the man sleeping near the fire and on the fire itself and on the sounds the mountain made when it was at its most serious. Dawn came gray and quiet. The storm had burned through. She heard, through the thick walls, the particular silence that followed heavy snowfall, the world muffled and reset, everything underneath a new layer of white. Rowan opened his eyes a few minutes after the light began coming through the window. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her, and she was still in the chair across from him, still wrapped in the blanket, still awake. You stayed up, he said. His voice was rough with sleep and more than sleep. Yes, she said. You didn't have to. I know, she said. I did it anyway. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something open in it, something that the usual guardedness wasn't covering, something that was past the point of being managed or controlled or presented carefully. He looked, for a moment, simply like a man who had come through something difficult and found, on the other side of it, a person who had stayed. How bad is it? He said, meaning the wounds. You'll live, she said. You're going to be miserable for a while. The shoulder, especially. She pushed herself upright from the chair, working the stiffness out of her back. I need to check the bandaging, and then I'm going to make coffee, and you're going to drink all of it and eat something whether or not you feel like it. That's not a question, he said, which was her own phrasing from last night, exact. No, she said. It isn't. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, same as always, but this time the thing adjacent to it was clearer than she'd seen it before, and warmer. She went to make the coffee. Behind her she heard him say quietly, almost to himself, That's not how I thought this winter would go. She didn't turn around. No, she said, to the stove, to the coffee pot, to the pale winter light coming through the south window. Me neither. Recovery, Elena discovered, was its own kind of hard work, not for her, for him. Rowan Ashcroft was a man who had built his entire existence around physical capability, around the body's ability to do what the mind directed without negotiation, and being reduced to a patient was something he had no practice at and very little patience for. The first 3 days he was cooperative out of necessity. The shoulder wouldn't allow much else, and the fever that came in on the second day, low grade but persistent, took enough out of him that he mostly stayed where she put him. But by the 4th day the fever had broken and the pain had settled from acute into the dull grinding category that was manageable if you were determined enough, and his determination was not something that knew how to stay idle. She found him at the workbench on the morning of the 5th day, standing with his right hand on the edge for balance, trying to do something with a piece of harness leather using only his right arm. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him. Rowan, I'm fine, he said without turning around. You said that when you came through the door bleeding from a wolf attack too. And I was fine. You had a fever for 2 days. The fever's gone. She crossed the room and came around the bench so she was in his sight line, which required him to either look at her or make a deliberate effort not to, and he was not a man who made deliberate efforts to avoid things. He looked at her. He looked tired and irritated, and underneath both of those things, faintly embarrassed in the particular way of someone who doesn't permit themselves to need help and is finding the prohibition difficult to enforce. What are you trying to do? She said. The north harness buckle is cracked. If I don't replace it before I can ride again, it'll be gone completely. She looked at the harness. She looked at his right hand, which was capable, and his left arm, which was in the sling she'd fashioned and needed to stay there for at least another week. She looked at the work itself, the threading and the tooling required, and made a rapid assessment. Sit down, she said. Show me what needs doing. He looked at her. You know harness work? My father had horses, she said. I know enough. Sit down and tell me what I don't know. He sat. It cost him something to do it. She could see the exact moment he decided to let it cost him rather than keep standing. And she appreciated the decision without making anything of it. He talked her through the repair, and she did the work and asked questions when she had them, and didn't ask questions she could figure out herself. And he watched her hands with the focused attention he gave to anything that mattered. And by the end of an hour, the harness buckle was replaced, and the work was solid. Better than I'd have done left-handed, he said. Obviously, she said, and handed him back the harness and went to start the midday meal. Behind her, she heard a sound that took her a moment to identify because she'd never heard it from him before. A short, quiet laugh. Not much of one, but real. The recovery set a new rhythm between them, different from the working rhythm of the weeks before. She carried more of the physical load of the homestead without discussion or accounting. It simply needed doing, and she did it. And he, unable to do the physical work, did other things. He mended equipment one-handed. He planned. He talked more than he had before, which she suspected was partly boredom and partly something the fever had loosened in him that hadn't entirely closed back up. One evening near the end of the second week, with his shoulder improving enough that he'd moved the sling to nights only, he told her about how he'd come to the North Ridge. He'd grown up 2 territories east, he said, family that farmed. He'd been the wrong kind of person for farming. Not lazy, but built for movement, for the kind of work that had no fixed location. He'd left at 19 after a bad winter that broke the farm's back and his father's spirit along with it. And he'd gone north because north was the direction nobody else seemed particularly interested in going. "Did you ever go back?" she asked. "Once," he said. 3 years after I left. My father had died the winter before. My mother was managing with my sister's family. And nothing," he said. "She was fine. She didn't need me there. My sister's husband was a better farmer than I'd have been." He paused. "I stayed 2 weeks, and then I came back north. It didn't feel like I was abandoning anything. It felt like confirming what was already true, that your life was up here, that I'd already made my choice, and going back didn't unmake it." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about that sometimes. The way choices get made before you fully understand you're making them." She thought about the barn, about the moment she'd taken his hand, about the week of preparation she'd done without knowing exactly what she was preparing for. "I think some choices are just clearer in reverse," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's it exactly." She told him that same evening something she hadn't told anyone. About the night before she'd left for the gathering, when she'd stood in her cabin doorway and seriously considered not going. About how she'd almost let the accumulated weight of the town's opinion make the decision for her. About the specific conversation she'd had with herself in the dark. The argument between the part of her that was exhausted and the part of her that refused to let exhaustion be the deciding factor. "I almost didn't go," she said. "I need you to know that. It wasn't courage. It was spite, mostly. I didn't want the town to have the satisfaction of me staying home." He was looking at her with that full attention quality. "Spite got you there," he said. "What kept you in the barn when you wanted to leave?" "Same thing," she said. "Probably." "I don't think so," he said. "I think you stayed because leaving felt like agreeing with them, and you didn't agree." She considered this. "Maybe, not maybe," he said quietly. "You know what you are, Elena. You've always known. That's rarer than you think." She looked at the fire. The thing his words did to the space behind her sternum was something she wasn't going to examine right now, in this chair, with the mountain dark outside and the fire burning, and him watching her with that steady, honest gaze. There were things you could look at directly and things you needed to approach sideways, and this was the second kind. "Your stitches need checking," she said instead, and got up to get the kit. He let her, which was also something. March arrived and the shoulder healed, and the mountain began, in its slow and reluctant way, to acknowledge that winter had limits. It wasn't dramatic. The temperatures dropped at night, and the snow stayed on the high ground, and there were still mornings cold enough to make going outside a full commitment. But the light was different. It came earlier and stayed later and had a quality to it, an angle, a warmth underneath the cold, that hadn't been there in January and February. She noticed it first on the south slope, where the snow was pulling back from the edges, the earth underneath appearing in patches that were dark and rich with the specific promise of ground that had rested long enough. She started her ground preparation in the first week of March, which was early by any reasonable standard, but she wanted to know what she was working with before the planting window arrived. Rowan watched her from the porch for the first 2 days, which she assumed was because the shoulder still limited what he could do physically, and watching her work was something to do. On the 3rd day, he came down into the south slope with her. "You should be resting that shoulder," she said. "I've been resting it for 3 weeks," he said. "I'll lose my mind." "You don't have to do heavy work to be outside," she said. "Walk the perimeter. Look at what I'm finding." He walked the perimeter. He looked at what she was finding. He made observations about the soil in the lower section that were accurate and useful. He'd cleared this land himself. He knew its topography in a way she didn't yet. And they worked through the morning in the easy coordination that had become, somewhere in the weeks of winter, their natural register. "The lower section drains too fast," she said. "I want to build it up before planting. Compost from the barn. And I want to bring soil down from the upper edge, the accumulation along the tree line. It's deeper there." He looked at the upper edge. "That's hauling work." "I know," she said. "I'll do it in loads. It doesn't have to be done at once. I can help with the hauling once the shoulders—" "You can help when the shoulder is actually healed," she said. Not when you've decided it's healed enough. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was being managed for his own good, and knew it and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about that. "Those aren't the same thing?" he said. "With you?" "No," she said. "They're about 3 weeks apart." A pause. "That's fair," he said, which was also something she'd learned about him. That when he was wrong or when he was being called accurately on something, he said so. Not easily, not dramatically, just plainly. It was one of the things she'd come to value most, in a winter that had given her a lot of things to recalibrate. The soil hauling took the better part of 2 weeks, done in manageable loads that she built into the daily routine the way she built in everything. Systematically, without rushing, integrated into the rest of the work rather than added on top of it. By the time the south slope was ready for planting, she had mapped it in her head down to the row, knew where the drainage was better and where it was still suspect, knew the 2 spots where the rock was too close to the surface and what she'd put there instead of root vegetables. It was good land, not easy land, Schatz. Nothing on this mountain was easy, but good. The kind of ground that rewarded the work you put into it, rather than taking the work and returning nothing. She planted the first seeds on a morning in late March when the temperature had climbed above freezing by mid-morning for 5 consecutive days. She did it with the particular focused attention she gave to things that mattered, working her way down the first row with the careful spacing she'd planned all winter. And she was halfway through the row when she became aware that Rowan was sitting on a rock at the edge of the cleared slope, watching. She kept working. "You've been planning this since November," he said after a while. "Since before November," she said. "I've been saving those seeds for 3 years, waiting for ground worth putting them in." He was quiet. Then, "I should have done something with this slope 2 years ago." "You didn't have anyone to tell you what to do with it," she said. "I didn't know I was waiting for that," he said. She looked up from the row. He was looking at the slope, at the prepared ground, at the careful work of the morning, with an expression that she'd learned to read now. The open book look, the one that happened when his guard went down without him deciding to lower it. He looked at the south slope the way a man looks at something that has become, without his full awareness, important to him. "Rowan," she said. He looked at her. "What we've built up here this winter," she said carefully, because she was not a woman who said things carelessly, "is something I didn't expect. Not the speed of it, not the weight of it." He was very still. "I'm not saying that to make things complicated," she said. "I just think we ought to say true things when we have them." He looked at her for a long moment. The mountain was quiet around them. A bird somewhere in the upper trees made a sound she'd learned to identify as a particular kind of woodpecker, the one that worked the old growth on the north face. The air smelled of cold earth and pine, and the very first distant suggestion of something warmer coming. "The night of the storm," he said, "when I came through the door." He stopped and started again. "I knew it was bad. I knew what the wounds needed, and I knew what I didn't have the capacity to do for them alone." Another stop. "I've been alone long enough that needing something from another person it doesn't come naturally." "I know," she said. "You didn't panic," he said. "You didn't ask me things I didn't have answers to. You just did what needed doing." He looked down at his hands, the left one still not fully back to its range, the scars from the wolf attack visible below the cuff. "I don't have the right words for what that was." "You don't need the right words," she said. "I was there." He looked up. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She held his gaze and felt the thing between them settle into a new configuration. Not sudden, not dramatic, the way these things were in stories, but the way it actually happened between actual people, which was gradual and then undeniable, and then simply there, solid as the ground she'd spent 2 weeks preparing. She went back to the planting. He sat on the rock and watched, and occasionally said something useful about the soil conditions or the drainage, and she listened and incorporated what was worth incorporating and filed away what wasn't, and the morning passed in the way their good mornings had learned to pass. 2 people working in proximity on something that mattered to both of them, the conversation woven through the work rather than separate from it. By midday, she had 3 rows in. By the end of the first week of April, she had the whole south slope planted, the work done right, done with the kind of attention that came from 3 years of saved seeds, and a whole winter of planning and the particular investment of someone who understood that what went into the ground was also a statement about what you believed the future looked like. She believed the future looked like this mountain, this slope, this homestead being built from two people's combined knowledge of how to survive and what to build toward, and when to say true things without making them complicated. It was not simple. None of it had been simple, from the barn forward, and she didn't expect it to become simple now. Rowan was not a simple man. She was not a simple woman. The mountain was emphatically not a simple place. There would be more difficult seasons and more nights when the weather made decisions for them, and more arguments over brackets and wood, and the distance between good enough and actually right. But the seeds were in the ground. The shoulder was healing. The cabin was stocked and warm and solid. The south slope was planted by a woman who had come to the north ridge with 40 pounds of saved seeds, and the specific stubbornness of someone who knew what they were worth even when nobody else did. Late one evening, near the end of the first week of April, she stood at the south window and looked at the slope in the last of the daylight. You couldn't see the seeds, obviously, couldn't see anything yet but the prepared earth, and Rowan came to stand beside her the way he had on the morning after the first storm, both of them looking at the same thing. "First green will show in 3 weeks," she said. "Maybe a little less if the warm holds." "I'll be here for it," he said. She looked at him. "You've got the high country circuit coming." "It can wait," he said simply. She looked back at the slope. The last of the daylight was going gold at the edges, the way it did at this altitude in the early weeks of spring, a particular quality of gold she'd never seen before coming up here, and that she'd found, somewhere along the way, she was attached to. "You don't have to wait for it on my account," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to see it." They stood at the window while the light went and the slope went dark and the first stars appeared above the timberline to the east, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. The winter was behind them. What it had made of them was still being determined, the way everything real is still being determined, one day and one decision at a time. But the foundation was there, in the healed shoulder and the planted ground and the stitches she'd put in by firelight and the harness she'd repaired while he talked her through it, and the long nights she'd kept the fire going when the storm had the mountain and he'd had nowhere else to be. It was there, underneath everything, solid and real and earned. And outside the window, under the dark south slope soil, the seeds waited for spring. The first green came in 17 days, not 3 weeks. Elena was the one who saw it. She was out on the south slope in the early morning, doing the check she'd made every day since planting, moving along the rows the way you move when you're looking for something you believe in, but can't yet see. And then there it was, a small thread of green pushing through the dark soil at the edge of the second row. Then another, 6 inches down. Then 3 more in the fourth row when she went to look. She stood there in this cold April morning with her hands at her sides and looked at those small green threads and felt something move through her that she didn't try to name. It was too simple and too large at the same time for a name to fit it. She heard the cabin door. Rowan came across the cleared ground with 2 cups of coffee, same as most mornings now, and stopped when he saw her standing still in the middle of the slope. "Elena?" "Second row," she said. "Look at the second row." He came and stood beside her and looked at the green threading up through the soil, and he was quiet for a long moment in the way he was quiet when something had genuinely reached him. "Early," he said. "The south aspect is better than I estimated," she said. "The warmth accumulates faster than I thought." He handed her one of the cups. She took it and wrapped both hands around it, and they stood there looking at the beginning of the garden that had been seeds in a box for 3 years and a plan on paper all winter, and now was this, actual, living, pushing up through the ground she'd prepared on the mountain she'd come to on the worst night of her recent life. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I left Iron Hollow," she said, "I told myself I was making a practical decision, that it was about land and resources and getting out of a situation that wasn't going to improve." She looked at the green. "I believed that when I said it. And now? Now I think I was also running toward something," she said. "I just didn't have the language for it yet." He was looking at her. She could feel it without turning. "I think I knew, somewhere under the practical accounting, that I needed to be somewhere that asked everything of me," she said, "not somewhere that had already decided what I was worth." She paused. "This mountain asks everything. And it doesn't care about my father or his debts or what the settlement thinks of me. It just asks. And I answer. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then, and us? He said. Is that practical too? She turned and looked at him then. At the man who had walked across a barn to talk to her, who had taught her the mountain's language, who had bled on her floor and let her stitch him back together, and said, I don't usually have someone to worry with the vulnerability of someone learning that vulnerability was survivable. The man who had sat on a rock and watched her plant seeds and said he'd wait for the first green because he wanted to see it. No, she said, that's not practical. Something in his face shifted into the open book expression, the unguarded one. Good, he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was 2 words from a man who didn't spend words on things he didn't mean. And it was enough. It was more than enough. She turned back to the green threading up through the dark soil. We need to get to work, she said. The seedlings that came up first will need protection tonight if the temperature drops. I'll check the weather signs, he said. I know you will, she said. They went to work. Spring on the North Ridge was nothing like spring in the valley. It didn't arrive generously, didn't come in warm and obvious and easy to believe. It came in pieces, in arguments with winter, in days that felt like May followed by nights that remembered January. It required patience and constant attention and the willingness to protect the fragile things through the cold that kept returning to take them back. Elena did not lose a single seedling. This was not luck. It was the specific result of watching the sky every evening, of covering the vulnerable rows on cold nights with the cloth she'd cut from an old blanket and pinned to stakes she'd driven into the slope edge, of waking at 2 a.m. when the temperature dropped faster than expected and going out in the dark to check. Rowan helped. He did it without being asked once she'd shown him what to look for, and there were nights when she woke and found he'd already been out, the covering adjusted, the stakes that the wind had pulled reset. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. It was just done. By the middle of May, the garden was real. Visibly, unmistakably real. Green rose against the dark earth. The cold, hardy crops already substantial, and the later plantings coming in behind them. She'd put in more than she'd originally planned, expanding into the section she'd reserved for fall on the confidence of how the soil had responded. There was something about the way this ground produced that exceeded her valley experience, a richness to it that she suspected had to do with decades of mountain leaf fall and snowmelt, and the particular composition of soil that had never been farmed before. Good ground. The best she'd worked. It was in the 3rd week of May that the first person came up from the valley. She was on the porch rehanging a door hinge that had pulled from the frame during a wind event when she heard the horse on the trail below. She straightened and watched the tree line, and a rider came through. A man she recognized after a moment as Martin Aussey, William Aussey's older brother, who ran a freight operation between the settlements. He pulled up at the edge of the cleared land with the slight hesitation of a man who wasn't sure of his welcome. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, and the name landed on her with a quality she still wasn't entirely used to, not because it was wrong, but because it was so different from what she'd been called all her life. Martin, she said, what brings you up? He had a commission, it turned out, a delivery that needed a staging point between the northern trade post and Iron Hollow, and someone had told him Rowan Ashcroft's place was positioned right for it. He wanted to know if there was space to shelter overnight on the way through, 2 or 3 times through the season. She told him she'd discuss it with Rowan and send word down. She offered him water, and he took it and looked around the homestead with the poorly concealed assessment of a man recalibrating something he thought he'd known. You've done considerable work up here, he said. We have, she said. Yes. He looked at the south slope, at the rows of green that were visible from the porch. He looked at the outbuildings, the new shelving she'd built along the storage barn wall, the wood she'd split and stacked with the methodical precision that Rowan had noted once was better than his own. He looked at the cabin itself, which had acquired small evidences of her presence, the kitchen herbs drying under the porch eave, the mended porch rail, the window she'd resealed against the drafts. The settlement wondered how you'd fared, he said. He said it carefully, like a man handling something that could cut him. We fared well, she said, equally careful, equally direct. He nodded. He finished his water and handed back the cup and gathered his reins. I'll look for your word on the staging arrangement, he said. You'll have it within the week. He rode back down through the tree line. She stood on the porch and watched him go and felt something she took a moment to identify. Not triumph, though that was in the neighborhood. Something more settled than triumph. Something closer to the quiet satisfaction of a fact that needs no defending because it's simply, plainly, visibly true. Rowan was in the workshop when she went back inside, working on a piece of equipment with the full use of his left hand now restored, the shoulder healed in the complete way that takes months, and that she'd monitored with the same attentiveness she'd given everything else. Martin Oss came up, she said. His brother William was one of the men at the gathering. Rowan looked up. What did he want? She told him. He considered the staging arrangement with the practical assessment he gave to everything. The benefit against the intrusion, the compensation they'd want, the terms that would make it worth the occasional disruption. They worked out an arrangement together in 20 minutes, both of them knowing what mattered and what didn't. He looked at the place, she said, when they'd settled the terms. I expect he did, Rowan said, without particular interest in what Martin Oss's assessment might be worth. He called me Mrs. Ashcroft, she said. He looked at her. Does that bother you? She considered it honestly. No, she said. I just wasn't expecting to feel anything about it. And you did. And I did, she said. Something, I'm not sure what exactly. He was quiet for a moment, hands still on the equipment. You've been Elena Cross your whole life, he said. The name with the weight on it. Yes. And now you're something else. I'm still Elena Cross, she said. I'm also Elena Ashcroft. They're not different people. She paused. But the name without the weight on it, that's something I'm still getting used to. He nodded slowly. You could keep Cross, he said. Professionally, for the trade accounts. She looked at him. She hadn't expected this offer, the quiet practicality of it. Why would you suggest that? Because Cross is the name you rebuilt, he said. That name has your work in it, not just your father's failures. A pause. You earned that name back. Seems wrong to leave it behind entirely. She looked at this man who was occasionally maddening, who had his own category of stubbornness, who didn't perform warmth but produced it in these specific and unexpected ways that got under her defenses because they were never calculated. He'd said that the way he'd said everything that mattered, plain and direct and without any apparent awareness of how significant it was. I'll think about it, she said, which meant yes, probably. Summer came fully in June, and the mountain was a different world from the one she'd arrived in. The snow retreated to the high peaks and stayed there, and the cleared land was green and the south slope was producing abundantly, more than she'd projected, the good soil exceeding her estimates. And the long mountain days had a quality of light that she'd grown to love. Long golden evenings that came late and lasted and made the work feel less like labor and more like the kind of living you chose. She worked hard through the summer because there was always work, because the harvest needed preparation and the preserving needed doing right, and the homestead had a dozen projects she'd been planning since February. Rowan did the high country circuit he'd delayed for spring. 2 trips, both of them without incident, both of them with her knowing exactly where he was on the trail and what day he'd be back. And both times he was back on the day he said he would be. She didn't stay up those nights. She trusted the information she had. This was different from before, and they both knew it. The settlement came back into their life not all at once, but gradually. The way things come back when you haven't sought them and haven't avoided them either. Martin Oss's freight arrangement meant regular contact. A woman named Clara from the smaller trading post 2 hours south came up in July asking about seeds for next season, having heard through Martin that Elena had a surplus of certain cold, hardy varieties. She stayed for coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about growing at altitude, and Elena sent her home with a paper packet of seeds and the growing notes she'd made through the season. Word travels in frontier country. It travels through freight arrangements and seed exchanges, and the simple human tendency to report what surprises you. What Iron Hollow heard, eventually, through the specific channels by which settlements hear things, was this: that Rowan Ashcroft had come down from the mountain with a woman none of them had expected him to choose, and that the North Ridge homestead had become, in a single winter and spring, something substantial. That the woman was the one running the agricultural side of it, that she'd put in a garden on ground that hadn't been farmed before and made it produce, that she'd kept the place running alone through the deep winter while Rowan worked the high country, that she'd saved his life, or something close enough to life-saving that the distinction wasn't worth arguing. It was Margaret Haverford who came up in August. Elena saw her from the porch before she reached the cleared land. That deliberate walk, that particular way of moving through the world on her own schedule. She came alone, which was itself a statement about the nature of the visit. Elena went inside and put water on and came back out to the porch to wait. Margaret pulled up at the edge of the cleared land and looked at the homestead with the long, sweeping assessment of someone who has been measuring things against her own internal standards for 60 years and has no intention of stopping now. "Elena Ashcroft," she said. "Mrs. Haverford," Elena said. "Come up." Margaret dismounted with the careful dignity of a woman who was not going to acknowledge that dismounting was harder than it used to be, and she tied her horse and came up to the porch and looked at the south slope, at the late summer garden in its full production, at the stacked and ordered evidence of a season's hard work on every surface of the homestead. She looked at it for a while without speaking. "I owe you something," she said finally. Elena waited. "I knew what that gathering would be for you," Margaret said. "I knew what the settlement had decided about you. I could have done something about that before the night of it, and I didn't." She said it with the flat honesty of someone who had spent the months since accounting for it. "I was curious, if I'm being truthful. I wanted to see what you'd do." "And?" Elena said. "You did exactly what I thought you'd do," Margaret said. "You stayed. You kept your head. And then Rowan walked in and I made a decision very fast, and I think it was the right one, but the road to it wasn't kind to you." Elena looked at her steadily. This was not the apology she'd expected. Too direct, too honest for a standard apology, too much like an actual accounting of facts rather than a performance of regret. Margaret Haverford was, in her own way, not entirely unlike the mountain. She didn't soften things for your comfort. She just stated what was true. "You wrote to Rowan," Elena said. "The letter in October." "I did." "You told him to come to the gathering." "I told him he was going to die alone in the high country and that he needed to stop being such a damn fool about other people." Margaret paused. "I may have also mentioned that there was a woman in the settlement worth his particular brand of attention." Elena stared at her. "You told him about me specifically." "I told him there was a woman who'd been managing a bad situation with more capability than the situation deserved," Margaret said. "I didn't tell him to choose you. That was his." A pause. "I just removed one of his reasons for not coming." The coffee was ready, and Elena brought it out, and they sat on the porch in the August afternoon, and Margaret drank her coffee and looked at the south slope and asked specific, intelligent questions about the soil work and the yield and the plans for fall and winter preservation. She was genuinely interested, not performing interest, actually interested. And Elena answered honestly and in detail, and somewhere in the middle of it she understood that Margaret Haverford was not here to apologize or to evaluate or to take any credit for anything. She was here because she was curious about what had grown out of the seeds she'd planted in October, and she respected what she was finding. "The others," Elena said at one point. "The men from the gathering. What do they think?" Margaret gave her a look that contained several things. "They think different things," she said. "Some of them are sensible enough to understand what they didn't choose. Others," she stopped. "Others aren't worth your consideration." "They never were," Elena said. "I just didn't know it then." Margaret looked at her with something that was, for Margaret Haverford, the closest thing to warmth in her expression. "No," she said. "But you know it now." Rowan came back from the workshop when he heard Margaret's horse, and they exchanged the particular greeting of two people who had known each other long enough that social grace was irrelevant. A nod from him, a look from her that covered a great deal of ground in a short time, a brief conversation about the freight arrangement and the state of the trails in the coming winter. When Margaret rode back down through the tree line in the late afternoon, Elena stood on the porch and watched her go and felt something complete itself, not in a dramatic way, in the quiet way of a last stitch being tied off. The wound closed, the necessary work finished, the recovery underway. She stayed on the porch until she couldn't hear the horse anymore. She thought about the woman who had walked across a frozen road in November with a thrown shoe on her horse and arrived 15 minutes late to a gathering she'd almost skipped, who had stood against the wall and held her face together through 9 rejections and gone outside once to breathe and come back in because running away was her father's move and she refused to inherit it. who had taken the hand of a stranger on the basis of 40 words and the specific logic of having nothing left to lose. That woman was not gone. She was still here, in this body, on this porch, looking at this mountain that had demanded everything and taken it and given back something she hadn't known to ask for. She thought about what her mother had said once, when Elena was small and the world was smaller, the place where you're asked to be everything you are. That's the place you're meant to be. Her mother had been talking about their small farm in the valley, but the principal traveled. The door opened behind her. Rowan came and stood beside her on the porch. He had coffee, same as always. He handed her a cup and looked at the slope and the tree line and the sky going gold at the edges with the particular altitude gold she'd learned to love. She stayed a while, he said. She did. What did you think of it? Elena considered. I think she's been managing this territory for 30 years in her own way, she said. And I think she's decided I'm worth the effort of an honest conversation. High praise from Margaret, he said. I know, she said. I'll take it. They were quiet for a moment. The mountain made its sounds. Wind in the high timber, a bird, the faint movement of the horses in the small barn. The south slope was going amber at the edges in the late light, the garden full and abundant, the work of the season visible and real. I've been thinking, Rowan said. She waited. The east section, he said. The thin soil you rode off in spring. I want to bring fill down from the upper north ridge before the first frost. Bank it over winter. By spring it could be workable. She looked at him. That's significant hauling work. I know. It would take most of September. I know, he said. I've got September. She looked at the east section, at the thin soil she'd assessed in March and set aside as insufficient. She looked at it with the new information of a full season's experience on this mountain, with the knowledge of what the good soil could do when you gave it what it needed. The upper north ridge fill would need to be mixed with the barn compost, she said. Not applied directly. I thought the same, he said. 2-to-1 ratio, maybe 3-to-1. I can work the numbers, he said. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. September. He nodded. They stood on the porch together in the gold of the late afternoon and looked at the work they had done and the work still ahead, and neither of them spoke because the conversation had reached the place where words were beside the point. This was what it was. Not a story with a clean ending, not a life that had resolved into something simple and certain. A homestead on the North Ridge that was still becoming what it was going to be. A man who was still, in the specific ways that people are always still, figuring out how to let another person fully into the territory of his life. A woman who was still learning the difference between the survival she'd always known and the kind of living that asked for more than just survival. Hard things had made them. Hard things would keep coming. The mountain didn't renegotiate those terms. There would be more wolves and more storms and more nights when the cold got serious about what it wanted. There would be more moments when his stubbornness and her stubbornness arrived at the same place from different directions, and one of them had to move first. There would be seasons when the work was too much, and seasons when the land didn't give back what they put in. But the foundation was real. It had been tested and it held, and what held under that kind of testing was not fragile. The woman that Iron Hollow had rejected in November was standing on a porch in August, looking at a mountain that was hers, beside a man who had learned what it meant to wait for someone worth waiting for. She had not arrived here by luck or rescue or the intervention of anything outside herself. She had arrived here by coming back